Rob Bailey. Can you hear me? Rob Bailey, Chatham House. First of all, thank you to all the panel members for some fascinating presentations, lots of food for thought. I just wanted to share some reflections which I think chime with a lot of what we've heard actually from some research that we've been doing at Chatham House, looking at low carbon development in the context of poorer countries, middle income countries and developed countries, which has been funded by CDKN. And one of the things that we've done as part of that is look at the recent history of late industrializers to see exactly what were the key ingredients for success for those countries that were undertaking rapid industrializations, because I think you can draw some parallels between an industrialization project and a low carbon development project, low carbon transformation project. And one of the key things that you see is that there was a national political project with key leadership from a strong central government figure, cross-ministerial support, engagement of the private sector, engagement of civil society. Another thing that you see is that there was considerable government capacity. There was a strong state, and it wasn't so much about the ability to pick the right policy interventions, but it was about the ability to manage that process, manage the creation and withdrawal of rents, resist policy capture from the private sector, and keep the whole thing going. And I think what you see from the point of view of relevance to this discussion is that for the poorer countries, there are big questions about how we can build sufficient government capacity and strong enough states to manage a project like that. And I think that raises some serious questions for donors, because are donors willing to invest in capacity building, these sorts of intangible capacities rather than specific project-led initiatives? Are they willing to support piloting and policy experimentation with the risk of failure, but the possibility to adopt success and then run with it?
Do you have a question?
Well, that's one question, I think. And then the second question is on the developed country side of things. The real challenge seems to be political. And I wonder what the panelists think about the opportunities for the political space to open up now that we seem to be coming out of economic recession in a lot of contexts, and we have the 2015 opportunity on the horizon.
Okay, let's get a few more questions. Yes, the gentleman behind you, Rob. Can you say who you are?
Yeah, I'm Ilmi Granov, very recently from ODI.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Actually, to sort of turn the end of my colleague's observations into a question, and I'll direct this primarily at Dr. Rahman. What has Bangladesh done to push the commitments of high-level management like yourself and interest and enthusiasm in the issue down into the middle management of the relevant agencies and ministries, where individuals may not have the opportunity to travel to international conferences, become familiar with the various tools, or even have a basic interest or awareness of what all this stuff is about?
Okay, let's take one more question down this end. The lady on the far end here, please.
Hi, yes, Elizabeth Redman with IHS. I was just curious if the panelists could comment on, there's been a lot of interest in developing countries and in U.S. states of exploring natural gas resources, both from shale and other offshore deposits. And given that that's, maybe not on the agenda of people that are trying to prevent or eliminate fossil fuel energy generation, but it's also significantly less emissions than coal, which is often the alternative source of energy in these regions. And it also drives a lot of investment into developing countries and sort of creates a potential for economic development on the development path. If you can comment on your perspective, looking at it both from an economic development lens and a climate change lens of increasing the amount of energy being generated from natural gas, and sort of where you stand on that, or what you think the issues that need to be addressed as we move forward in natural gas exploration and production.
I'll go back to the panelists first, and we'll do another round of questions, like one from online as well. So Rob, you asked a pretty broad question. I mean, it'd be good to hear from you, Dr. Rahman, about this issue about the role of donors in this process, about building the capacity to respond, to move, to transform the economy. I think this is a sort of line that you were talking about, and the kind of political space to do that?
Bangladesh is in a, I would say, relatively more advantageous position than many other countries. As you know, 40 years of its existence, we have been living very, very, I would say, interactively with the development partners. Initially it was a relief case, but then finally it went into development phase, and it had a light touch kind of regulation, so that a lot of non-governmental organizations, others could come in. It's a social laboratory, I'll call you. MFIs, some of the biggest NGOs of the world are all there, and all that has been influencing the policy making of the country, because the interaction between these non-governmental think tanks and the government, this interaction is very deep. So that has influenced the policies of the government, and development partners like DFID or USAID and many of the bilateral partners from the Scandinavian countries, they have all been working together. And Bangladesh, as I said, being least emitting countries, opted for a low carbon development on its own to remain on a morally on a high ground, that okay, we are the victims, but we can show to the others that we too can invest from our modest resources. Every year we are investing from our national budget about $100 million just for the climate change. And now other development partners have come with the climate risk fund, where the British government has also put in. So there are two funds: the national fund, there is a climate fund, national fund has been created, and also a development partners fund has created. So it's going hand in hand. I sit in that climate trust fund, as a member of the trust. And as you said, it's very fortunate for a governor to sit into those committees and the trusts, and so that we can bring in the elements. Again, a part of that fund, national fund, whatever we have created, we give part of that fund to a wholesale organization called PKSF. Some of you may know who coordinates the MFIs. So through that federal agency, they pass on part of the money to the NGOs, to the local initiatives, so that they too can take part into the.
So is that transformation happening at the middle level?
At the middle level. So that's how it's all happening. So development partners have been quite active in Bangladesh. There was little problem on the who will conduct the fiduciary role, and World Bank has opted out that we play the role for the foreign funding, and the ministry is playing for the local funding. So together is going. The press is quite vibrant, and everybody is watching what the government is doing. But on the whole, I would say it's quite a engaging experience. But as you said, beyond these national kind of initiatives, the regulator like me, who has jumped in because of my own background. I was a very activist in the environment movement. Many of you may have come across People's Report on Environment, which I edited long before I became a governor. I used to regularly eco-file. I used to edit from the community perspective of the environment. So I had that perspective. The moment I jumped into the central bank, I thought, because we control so much of resources, let's transform the central bank into a developmental regulator. So that's what I did, and then we put in a green banking mechanism in place. We now have a green bank and social responsibility department in our midst. And we encourage banks to really come forward for social responsibility, so that we aware the concept. I just give you an example. One of the banks has created a fund, and that fund is a challenge fund. that challenge fund, they have in addition with the national newspaper, they invite the best of the community actions taken and they award them, and the bank, they call it a CSR, social responsible fund, and every bank has to report to me how much they have spent on CSR every year, and how much they have done on climate change, how much they have done on poverty reduction, or they have done on hospitals or scholarships for the students. So every time I get the report, and the moment I get that report, we put it in the central bank website, and also the report, put it in the website that rating them who has done the best. So putting in some positive competition. That's how the central bank is in a driving seat in taking all the financial institutions and engaging them for this kind of activities. So that's how we are moving on.
Thank you. Jennifer, the issue about gas would be an interesting one to hear from you, but any of the other issues, please pick up on those.
Sure. No, I think it's a really incredibly important question. I think WI has done some work on gas, and particularly on fugitive methane emissions, basically looking at if you want, from a climate perspective, gas to be, quote, better than coal, where do you need to get the leakage rates towards? One key challenge is the data challenge, but it seems to me as if you want gas to be part of that solution, then first of all, putting in place, this is one thing the administration has yet to do, is the regulatory framework to actually get those methane emission reductions, and those are our senses that's best practice. Actually, it's so making sure that the gas on the methane side is truly, quote, low carbon, but also making sure that you're investing heavily and you're doing a low emission development strategy for renewables, because of course the big risk is that this gets built, you get entrenched interests one more time, and you don't actually transition to where we need to get to unless you're also investing in carbon capture and storage, which with your gas at the same time. So I think having that kind of long-term thinking, which is incredibly difficult to have, if I may say so, in the United States, it's been really a dash for gas, and we're trying to bring these types of issues in, but very challenging. But for a country like China, which has large shale reserves that are difficult to get to, but this is a key piece to be looking at, I think, in the future, and can help change some of the politics. But don't get fooled by the short-term gains, would be and make sure they're real gains if you don't deal with the methane. And just really quickly, on the political space, I think it is starting to open up a bit. I think the fact that all countries have to bring their national offers internationally, and the work that you all have been doing on the lead side and the plans is incredibly important, and making sure that they're done in a way that's transparent and can engage many stakeholders, I think, is quite important to build the political space further. So thanks.
Thanks. I'll come back to the rest of the panel in a minute, but I want to put a couple of questions on the table because I think it builds on this, and also go to other colleagues. Tom Mitchell, who's online, and please, others online, do send your questions in. But Tom's asked two really interesting questions. Experience of the panel on subsidy reform in relation to fossil fuel subsidies. So, so what's the storyline there? We've seen Nigeria addressing that, so it'd be good to get a sense of overall progress on that. And also, are there examples of countries, Tom asks, that have simultaneously maintained growth, reduced greenhouse gas emissions per economic input, and reduced poverty? So, has that triple win occurred, and where's the best evidence out there? Maybe I know Jennifer's going to leave soon.
I have to leave.
Do you any comments on those?
My quick responses on the last question is to look to Germany, which I know is not a developing country, but if the Energiewende that Germany is currently undertaking is successful, I think they already have basically scaled up renewables or scaling out a large power source of nuclear. They have the lowest unemployment they've had for years. They now have this challenge, though, of making sure that it is socially equitable, because the way that the system has been set up is that many of the large energy-intensive users don't have to pay any of the extra fees, and so the lower income households are actually having to pick up the extra cost. So some of the comments that you made, Ed, are very relevant. So That's the best example I have now of an economy that's out there. And if they go to their 80% renewables by 2050 and are successful, then hopefully it can show real transformation. Apologies for having to take over.
No,
thank you
Jennifer,
very
thank
much.
you so much for being here. Ron, do you want to share any examples on that triple
Sure.
if it exists?
I think there's a number of developing countries that are leading the charge there. I think they're in some ways still works in progress, so they can't declare complete success. But Colombia, South Africa, Mexico, Vietnam, Chile, Kenya are all ones that have made substantial progress with policies and programs to reduce the growth rate in emissions, achieve economic development, and reduce poverty. And it's very interesting to look at their goals and targets for their low emission development plan. They have specific targets for GDP growth, for poverty reduction, and for emission reductions. And so they have action plans lined up associated with very kind of specific goals based on analysis that they're mobilizing efforts around. And I'm not sure any of them are fully, I can say the work's gone far enough to fully prove that they're there yet, but they are headed on the right path.
So, I mean, we talk a lot about climate-compatible development in CDKN and hitting this triple win of achieving development, building resilience, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is essentially, I think, the question that Tom has asked. Susanna, how good is the evidence based on this triple win? Because we're not sure of the answer to that question yet ourselves in CDKN, I don't think.
Yes, I think that from our experience of the LDCs, it's really too early to say where do these triple wins always exist and how far we're going to find them in practice. I think there's a lot of theoretical evidence and research out there on the theory behind these triple wins, but now what we need to do is as these policies are actually put into practice, is take a slightly critical stance and be sure that we evaluate those fully as to where and how they're going to emerge. And I think that's why in the LDCs it's very much a kind of learning by doing approach, in that they're hoping for these triple wins in the policy planning, they're implementing them in some cases in their development planning frameworks, but it's through the experience and also through mistakes that those will be better secured. I also just quickly wanted to touch on, if that's okay, on a couple of the other questions that were raised. I think on the question of government capacity building that our colleague from Chatham House raised, this is obviously a key issue. It's also about not just the capacity, but what parts of government are involved in the planning process. So I think what we're seeing, which is quite encouraging, is a move beyond the Ministry of Environments to the Ministries of Finance and central kind of planning functions, which are also embedding climate change, and that enables or low carbon, that enables the agenda to have in some ways more power, and also in some cases where the line ministries are involved, much greater implementation potential. And obviously in some of the LDCs they're looking for a complete mainstreaming approach, so there hasn't been a climate change specific policy or strategy, but it's been moved into the national poverty reduction strategy in the case of Rwanda, the national socioeconomic plan, it's the aspiration in Lao PDR, and similarly in the Gambia they're looking for a mainstreaming approach. So then the contextual issues of government capacity around those strategies exist, but it's perhaps not a separate issue on climate change. And I also just quickly want to take this opportunity to ask a question, if that's allowed.
Yeah, that's definitely who's it for?
I wanted to ask our colleague from DEC about how much your work on energy is also looking for these kind of synergies that we're talking about elsewhere in terms of climate compatible development. So it seemed to me quite a lot of what you're suggesting around energy efficiency or kind of insulation, household level, could also relate to how households might respond to extreme temperatures. So I just wondered how much there's an interface in the UK government between energy policy and the National Adaptation Plan, and how much we see those things that we're hoping for in the LDCs and elsewhere emerging in the UK.
Let's go to you. Dr. Rahman's going to comment on subsidies in a minute, which I'm looking forward to. But let's go to Ed and Pippa if there's anything else you want to add on this triple win thing, and then we'll go to the last round of questions.
I think in terms of synergies, we obviously in DEC are very, very conscious about the impact of all of this on energy bills, and particularly understanding the sorts of groups in the population that might be most exposed to price hikes. and we've got detailed programs there that look to target support to the households that tend to have the poorest levels of energy efficiency and the least able to pay. And we do work a lot with the Department of Environment, which is responsible for adaptation and resilience. And I think a lot of the stuff is going on kind of at a working level, but we could maybe do a bit more to communicate about, because we're DEC, we're very focused on energy and emissions, but as hopefully came through from my presentation, we're also interested in talking about the impact that all of this is having on economic growth and job opportunities. So it's very, very important for us to be able to show all of the obvious co-benefits that this type of transition can provide. And just in terms of the point about middle management and providing capacity building there, I think one of the really interesting things about the project that we're involved with, compared with the other support that the UK is offering financially for developing countries on climate change, is the budget is very, very small for the project that we're working on. It's only £2 million over a 2.5-year period. But what we are providing is just the experience of our team, which has done this before and has made mistakes. And it isn't just a 2-week visit or a 2-day visit. It's kind of like a call center operation where people can either completely ignore us or call us up every day if they want to. And it is actually quite hard to get the cover from other people within your organisation to enable that sort of project to happen. So hopefully it will be one of the lessons that we learn as a result of the work that we've done, that often it's obviously big amounts of money help, but small amounts of money plus some people around to do a bit of hand-holding and just share experiences is quite helpful as well.
Pippa, do you want to comment now or later?
Yes, I think to Rod's point, in terms of what we're doing definitely in Latin America with CDKM, but in other countries as well, I think the ability with DFID support and from the Dutch government is to actually have a medium-term country strategy where you're actually looking at 3 to 5 year processes with capacity inbuilt. So, some of these governments, what's classic is just this rotation of personnel. So you train, they go, you train, they go. They're still out there, and you'll find that the next day they're your minister or the CEO or whatever. So that's happening in the ripple effect. But actually, it's being there long term. And as Jennifer was saying, it's actually having politically well-placed agents, who are working with government beyond certain political administrations. And that engagement strategy, as we call it in CDKN, has helped develop that capacity and overcome some of these failings. In El Salvador, we're actually doing support to institutional strengthening of the ministry, of just how post-conflict, with all your civil service of capacity wiped out, how you build up that technical institutional capacity again with the new challenges. So, in there looking at institutional effectiveness. So I think that's one of the strengths of CDKN and why it enables it to do it. On the triple wins, I think what we've moved beyond the idea of, does this tick 3 boxes? In CDKN, because we're looking at this in-depth country work, it's much more about how do you overcome the silos of adaptation and mitigation which are dysfunctional, which have come down through governments, mainly through the UNFCCC and financial mechanisms and channels, which have then been reflected in institutional structures and projects within government. The areas we're looking at is people sort of go, actually, we're working on development. We're working on better development, and we're looking at how you don't have contradictions or perverse incentives from one side of government which are defeating the objectives in the other. And where it's working with most impact is at city level, because actually you don't have all these the great ministerial sections. And at city level, finding that it's around the city local development plans and local especially land use planning is where we get the CCD approach. It's where you've got binding regulatory frameworks for saying, how do you think about resilience and vulnerability, but how do you ensure competitiveness as well at the same time with mitigation? That's, I think, Susanna, is where, it's not ticking the 3 boxes. We may have some great examples of best practice around that, but our best practice is much more about that more joined up way of CCD looking.
Thank you, Pippa. I'll come back to Dr. Rahman. I want to just do the last couple of questions to put on the table. So I know Dan has a question over here.
Thanks, Dan Hamza-Godeka from CDKN. My question's for Ed. It particularly struck me when you talked about the Climate Change Act that we have an absolute target. We had a very interesting discussion last night at Chatham House about the global climate change deal in 2015 and whether we needed an absolute target. Because a 2-degree target, which is what we currently have, is potentially too intangible to incentivise any action. So in the light of that, I'd be interested to know if we had only a 2-degree target in our legislation in the UK for the Climate Change Act rather than an absolute target, how different would things be today? And then secondly, how realistic do you think it is to have an absolute target in the 2015 deal?
Okay, yes.
Hi there. I work for Crown Agents. My name's Kamlesh. I just had a general question to all members of the panel, and that was in relation to, we have the ODI, we have think tanks, we have research institutions, but have you come across particular private sector companies, big companies that actually have taken a lead in knowledge dissemination nationally in their own countries? And have there been lessons learned of how to integrate them into the national adaptation policies or plans? So obviously I think there's a massive role for them.
Yeah, no, it's a nice challenge for us all to think about. Last question over here. Does the gentleman here? Do you have a question? No? Any more questions? Oh, sorry, quickly, Alexandra. And just make it very short, because I then just go down the panel and
Neil Walmsley from Ricardo AA. I'm quite interested in the topic of resilience building in cities and how to encourage private sector investments in resilience building and crossing over into mitigation as well. So things like retrofitting buildings, water efficiency in industry, all these different things. There are a number of initiatives that different banks have been developing in the last year or two, and I was wondering what the Central Bank of Bangladesh has been looking at in this area.
Okay, thank you. Last question to a well-known facilitator to see if you can.
Thank you. Alexandra Stubbings, Talek & Co. It also relates to that, which is about risk tolerance in mainstream capital and accessing alternative, novel sources of capital. So I was just interested to hear more about strategies for that.
Okay, well, I have a question from a colleague in India called Keshav, which is around CDKN working with cities on NAMAs in developing countries. So I think that's going to relate to this. So I'm going to just work down the line here, I think, and ask whether Susanna has any of those questions you want to pick up on, just as a final set of words.
I thought I'd just quickly pick up on the private sector issue. Obviously, there are kind of piecemeal examples of private sector innovation in different national contexts in the LDCs. One thing I thought was particularly interesting was in Rwanda, where there's something called the Private Sector Federation, which is an alliance of the private sector organizations that's working in partnership with the Rwandan Environmental Management Authority to work with SMEs to enable them to start to access different forms of finance and to start on this issue. And I think that provides an interesting example of how it's not necessarily at the moment going to be just about the private sector innovating or disseminating, but that kind of partnership between how the public sector can enable SMEs and the national private sector to play a particular role in each context.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Ron, pick up on some of these points.
A couple reactions on a good question about sort of companies that are demonstrating leadership. I was just at the 3GF forum, the Global Green Growth Forum, which has CEOs and high-level political leaders. So a couple things that emerged that were sort of shining examples there. I mean, and they're all some self-interest here, right? But often enlightened self-interest is where you get the biggest impact. So IKEA is phasing out selling any bulbs that aren't LEDs. And along with that, though, they're engaged in a consumer education campaign about the benefits of LEDs. So it's both helping their business, but they're also making a commitment throughout society. Coca-Cola has made huge strides in improving water efficiency and is also at the same time working very actively with companies throughout the industry to share their best practices. And there's a number of other examples, but those are two. But one thing we don't do a great job of, I think, is figuring out how to bring those companies into the dialogue with governments and how to together kind of work on these education efforts and efforts to change consumer behavior and demand. On the risk tolerance one, just a couple quick things that are really fascinating to see. The national development banks for a lot of the emerging economies, which are dwarf the size of the funding that comes through the World Bank and the regional development banks, are working together. They have a coordinated group that are looking at how can they best mobilize capital to support green economic development. And that's a huge source of funding. There's also the institutional investors, the pension funds and others that are all huge sources of capital, also have forums. And one of our challenges as a community working with governments is to figure out how to link up with those sources.
From just a perspective on cities, CDKN works with an interesting variety of actors and partners in support to building resilience and low carbon development in cities. We have a partnership with Atkins, for example, which is highly active in terms of thought leadership, in terms of building its own business capability in this, and it's a massive global company. And we have an interesting partnership with them. But we also work with learning networks such as ICLEI and research institutions such as ISET. So it's that mixture of actors. But ultimately, the success is going to come when it's internalized, as I think Atkins is seeking to do. You know, there are companies in London like Climate Change Capital that are trying to channel investment into these areas to manage the higher areas of climate risk. But they're only a drop in the ocean, really, of the money that needs to be leveraged. And I think there's a whole set of work, much of which is going on here in London, and which we heard about in Chatham House with Rob over the last couple of days, to try and leverage that, because that is ultimately the big challenge. You know, the 100 billion is, you know, is really just a catalyst, or, you know, climate finance from public sector is just a catalyst for the much larger sums. So CDKN has to be part of that process too. So I really like your question. I think it's a challenge to all of our work. Dr. Moran, there were various questions that came in your direction.
Thank you. Let me start with this subsidy question, because nobody has touched on that yet. You know,
quite brief. Actually.
Yeah, I need to be a bit brief. I know, but it's a huge issue. Subsidy. You know, there are a lot of subsidies for the conventional, for fossil fuel kind of energy in a country like ours. But what is good about Bangladesh fiscal policy is that they are in a mood to hear us. You know, we from the central bank, you know, we sit in that monetary policy coordination committee with the finance minister, and then we tell that you cannot go on expanding subsidies for this conventional, traditional kind of, oil subsidies, and making climate even more vulnerable. And they, in a way, heard us. You know, now they are reducing the subsidy, making it, a market-based kind of subsidization. And at the moment, Bangladesh is in a very good stage. The budget deficit is only around 4%. You know, because of our intervention, the subsidy is coming down, and it's about 4%. And this has been consistently below 5% for the last decade or so. And we don't expect, because most of the public borrowing they do through us from the central bank. So we cannot put a cap, but we always discourage them to go for public borrowing, and that is working. So it's almost impossible to substitute the conventional, energy by the new energy, the new carbon. So we'll have to have a mix, total mix. But let's see how we can reduce the more subsidy from the conventional one and give more subsidy to the new ones. And what we do even in the last budget, they have allowed tariff waivers for LED bulbs, for treatment plants equipments, for solar panels, PV panels. So these are the new kind of subsidies we are trying to push to keep the balance. On the one hand, they are reducing the subsidy for the conventional one. On the other hand, they're raising this tax waivers and other tax holidays for the industries, for solar, and so that gives a a kind of chosen mix of traditional and the one. So there we are working. Another incentives we are giving, as someone was asked about, the noble financing. Central bank itself has created a renewable energy fund of 2 billion taka initially, and this fund, all the commercial banks, be it private or public, they can take that money at the bank rate, which is not even half of the total rate, at the bank rate, and they can pass this money to a company, to an NGO, or to an individual with certain spread, about 4-5% spread, and this is much cheaper than the conventional financing. And using this fund, some of the big companies like Rohim Afroz, many of you know, they have gone for a solar PV assembling companies. There are other companies who are going for mini grid. They are going for rice husking based electricity production. So these are and there is another company called ITCOL, is a financial institution, government owned. There too, they are providing support for all the solar homes. As I said, 2.2 million solar homes have been supported by that, and there is a mini grid supported by that. So a lot of things are moving. So we are walking on two legs. We are reducing this, conventional subsidy, and we are enhancing the some of the incentives and the tax waivers for the new ones. So together probably we'll come up with a better solution in the coming days. And the central bank playing a major role in terms of not only advocacy but also providing fund from its own, and is quite open-ended. We can expand that fund. And ADB has come in to give us $50 million to start with this, the clean bricks production fund. We operate through that. World Bank and other, JICA has given us another a big fund for retrofittation of the factories which are less compliant, the textile factories, so that after this Rana Plaza tragedy, Central Bank has taken the move to create a fund with a Japanese support, so that retrofittation of the smaller industries can take place, so that they become all compliant. So that's how we are all moving together.
Thank you very much. Well, of course, next time we're going to get Mark Carney in the room alongside you. But Ed, we have a progressive policy framework in the UK. Is there any final comments you want to make?
Yeah, just to respond to Dan's point, this is a personal view, but I think it came through when the Climate Change Act was being debated as well. I think not having an absolute target would have made it very, very difficult for us to enable to work out what's the final goal, because I think the tendency would have been to just gradually weaken ambition and say, well, we've got a 10% chance of hitting 2 degrees with this eventual thing. And my personal view would be to do the same at a global level would be pretty dangerous as well, because I could see it being a kind of race to the end of the probability spectrum and just buying a sort of 5% chance of hitting 2 degrees rather than what a risk professional might suggest was a more prudent way of going about it.
So the fact that the UK has had already a carbon budget and the IPCC has now essentially set a global budget seems to set a framework for the advantage of being progressive. The UK is better placed to respond to the framework of the IPCC than countries that haven't already set that. So I think it raises the important argument for countries to move ahead, to take the risk and be progressive. Are going to be winners in this kind of race to low carbon. Pippa, very short final word because we've run over time.
No, and I think that's why some of the countries that we're working with in Latin America are being sort of quite ambitious and part of that ambitious agenda as well, because that's what they banked on around Copenhagen, and they set those targets then, assuming that would be better for them in the in terms of competitiveness and actually getting that edge. So what we've seen the difference between Chile and Peru is Chile had a target and Peru didn't. And so that has really stimulated all the debate of how do we comply with that? What's that really going to mean now, in real terms? So I think one in terms of urgency, Sam, that yes, having that target and having that as a narrative coming at 2015 would definitely be supported by the countries we're working with in Latin America. Some of them are already there, so of course that gives them even greater motivation to to elicit collective ambition around that one, I think.
So thank you very much to our panel. Thank you for those who joined online, and thank you for those who came here this morning. I hope, lots of food for thought, as Rob said, and hopefully you've seen some patterns in this about progressive action in the framework of national action, but linking to the international process, and those two seem to be inextricably interlinked, it seems to me. So Susanna, Ron, Dr. Rahman, Ed and Pippa, thank you very much, and I think we should give you a round of applause.